Hey guys, welcome back. You are sitting on the hashtag MagnaOnAir digital network, Magna Search Group TV, the show, The Spotlight. We have a special guest with us in the studio today, Margaret Ward. Margaret Ward is sitting in the studio from Ireland. She's a born and bred New Yorker, moved back to Ireland 20 years ago. She's an entrepreneur. She's a journalist. She's a broadcaster and CEO of Clear Ink. Margaret, welcome to the studio.
Hi, Margaret.
Thank you very much, guys. Hello, Vancouver. Hello, everybody around the world. Nice to be here.
Yeah. So absolutely amazing, Margaret, having you here. We want to get to know who you are, right? We want to know what you've done and the causes that you care about. So why don't you share with our audience a little bit about who is Margaret Ward?
Okay. I guess Margaret Ward was a girl who grew up in New York to Irish parents in, I won't tell you exactly when, but it was a while ago. And I was an introvert. I spent a lot of time just reading books all the time. And after a while, I realized this wasn't getting me anywhere in life and I better do something about it. So I was very competitive in sports. I just loved playing sports with the boys all the time. And I, studied, but I always knew that I wanted to be a journalist and a writer. And that was probably down to All the President's Men. I know most journalists of my generation say that, but All the President's Men was just a watershed and I wanted to be an investigative journalist. So I worked 3 jobs, put myself through college, working as a journalist, became a journalist working for Gannett, Westchester, Rockland newspapers in the United States, started my first business there called Away with Words, had my first book published, which was a biography of Bob Marley, which was amazing. It was amazing. I was kind of a college radio DJ, and somebody approached me and said, I understand you're a journalist, and do you want to write this book on Bob Marley? And I was like, for who? You and your husband? And she's like, no, I'm a publisher, and it's my job to find people to write books. So I agreed to that, and amazingly, I think it was 100,000 copies that were published in a number of different languages. And that was then a huge door opener for me. So I worked as a journalist and then eventually thought, you know what, I'm never going to make a living doing this. So I started working on Wall Street and I worked as a marketing writer. And the thing that was super about that is they had a lot of money, right? So they had a television station, a radio station. They were on the cutting edge of multimedia. They had, these road shows that the CEOs and everything go on that were really high tech. They had their own sound crew and backstage people and everything. So I was writing for all these things, plus brochures, marketing reports. So I learned a huge amount about Wall Street, which is great. But I hated it, and I felt I'd sold my soul to the devil. So I knew something had to change.
Wow.
And then I had a chance to work on a research project in Ireland, which was based on Irish women's history. So I thought this is a great way out of Wall Street for a few months. Went over, was supposed to be for like 3 months, packed up my apartment, said, see you guys in a few months. And it's 20 years later.
Wow.
20 years later. So that research project, the short version is that basically I had to use the Irish Times library or their archive to do the research. And I went up being offered a job by the editor. I got my dream job working as an investigative journalist at the Irish Times. I mean, literally, it was, I don't know how these things happen. Mm-hmm. Then I went on to work at the Sunday Times and I was money editor at the Sunday Times. Then I had a couple of kids and thought, I just can't do the schedule anymore. And that's when I started Clear Ink, which is now 10 years old.
Wow.
That's it in a nutshell, folks.
So that'll lead us into our next question, Margaret, is tell us a little bit about Clear Ink, from its conception and where it is today. How did this all start? How did this become such an idea? And now obviously you're working with some of the world's leading brands. So tell us about that story.
Well, I guess I'm an accidental entrepreneur, to be honest. Born and bred a journalist and never would have left journalism if I had a choice. But our son was actually very sick for 2 years. So we spent a lot of time in and out of hospital. And I just thought, I can't do this, not sleeping, stressed out of my mind. So I quit. I quit the Sunday Times and just freelanced then for them. And I had a friend who also wasn't happy in her job. And we'd been talking for years about starting a business. So we decided we would just start doing plain English. Mm-hmm. So plain English was a big movement, as you know, in the UK from the 1970s. And we felt a lot of companies really needed some help with writing and editing. So after a couple of years then, she left the business. She wanted to travel. And I thought, customers actually want and need more than us to just make their stuff easy to understand. They need somebody who can really focus in on the customer and what the customer needs from them. And I guess because I had the marketing and the journalism background, and I had that experience working on Wall Street where people had no idea what they were saying, I realized that there was an opportunity to use my skill set for taking really complex information and making it easy and enjoyable to understand to a much wider market. So I started out small. I completely changed the company from plain English, really a couple of sole traders doing plain English editing and writing, to a brand communications agency. So what that means is we go into organizations who have rebranded or have grown exponentially, who really are concerned about what their customers and their staff think or feel about them. And it usually is when some disaster happens in terms of communications, where you have really annoyed employees or you have really annoyed customers or consumers. So we work at a very strategic level with the board and the executives and say, okay, tell us about your brand and your brand tone of voice. So they'll go, oh, we have this beautiful logo and we have this stationery and our brand agency charged us $15 million to, change this logo a little bit and we don't know what to do with it. You go, okay, well, if you have any money left, we can help you.
Yeah.
We can help interpret what this is supposed to be.
Yeah.
So we implement that. So they'll hand us that big stack from the brand agency and we'll say, okay, so you did a lot of research on this with them and that is a great logo and the colors are super, but let's talk about your brand tone of voice. So how do you communicate these new messages to your customers, to different segments of customers, but also to your employees? So we help design and create a style guide, which is like a good writing guide, telling the staff who have to write to customers or internally what words and phrases to use, what not to use, but also giving them the basics of good writing to empower them to write in a very clear and articulate way. And that's actually quite a powerful thing because most people, when they're in university or they're in secondary school, the type of writing that they do is academic writing. So they're writing for a lecturer or they're writing for a teacher. That's their audience. And their purpose is to impress them, right?
Yes.
So to use big words, and I know this fact, and I know that fact. But when you go into the business world, if you do that, you're just going to really annoy people.
It's true.
That's true.
It's true, yeah.
That's true.
It's too much.
Well, we talk all the time in a sales capacity about tonality and the nuances, of a conversation. Hearing what you have to say, would you go into an organization for a common tone, or do you talk to the organization about, I guess, different audiences within that organization and having a tone that's relatable to that particular person or that particular department or customer, or whatever it is, but it still has to be tied into the master message?
Yes. So if you think about what journalists do every day, journalists are writing articles on particular topics for different publications and audiences, right? So if I'm writing something for the Chicago Tribune about the European economic situation, the article I write for them is going to be very different than if I'm writing something for The Economist, if I'm writing something, for an Australian magazine about it. So the first thing you do as a journalist, any professional writer, you think about who is my audience and what is my purpose. And your language is crafted around that because you have to give relevant examples and you have to use phrases and terminology that they will understand. So if I'm writing for, somewhere where they don't know about Breaking Bad, for example, and I'm using that as an example, they're going to be like, what is this? And you've lost them. So what we do when we go into the organization is we say, okay, based on your brand values, so you're professional, you're accessible, you're friendly, that's all fine. But how does that translate in every single word that you use? So there will be an overall brand tone of voice, but then we'll say, look, if you're writing a customer letter and you're trying to get business, it's a sales letter, your tone in that is very different from when you're trying to collect money from them. And it's the 10th letter you've written trying to get that money, right? So there's escalation. The funny thing about human beings is that we do this automatically when we meet people. right? We change our tone depending on who we're talking to. If you are talking to a child, you are using phrases that they understand. So if, I'm talking to my kids about what is a recession, I'm going to use very different terms for them, using language and examples that they'll understand, as opposed to if I'm talking to somebody, who works on Wall Street. So when we see one another face to face, we do that. But there's a disconnect between our brains and the written word because of the way that we were trained in university or secondary school. So we go in and we empower people to write in this new tone of voice that is more like their own tone of voice anyway, and in a way that puts them in the customer's shoes immediately. So they find, and we have lots of stats on this, that they're writing faster, more efficiently, and with greater impact. Because when people get what they've written, it's like they're talking to another human being. So you can imagine how powerful that is.
There's an element of critical thinking there that you're teaching, correct?
Yes, and that's actually our biggest growth area. And major corporations, so, we work with Accenture, Google, Twitter, the European Central Bank, law firms around the world. These are big, big organizations. And the biggest complaint they have about their employees is that they lack critical thinking skills. So the traditional form of education that our parents would have gotten had a lot of critical thinking skills in it, but that educational system in a lot of the world was changed in the 1970s, and that was stripped away. So although people today are very good about learning lots of facts, they're not good at questioning, right? That's terrible. Not asking questions. If you can't ask questions, that means you're not thinking. So a journalist's job, again, is to ask the most annoying questions possible, right? So we teach people what are the 5 W's and the H of anything that you do. It's the who, what, when, where, why, and how. And those are the basic components of critical thinking. So the next stage in our evolution in Clear Ink, we've been in business 10 years, we work with these large global, companies around the world, is actually to develop critical thinking strategies, modules, product, all that kind of stuff, because that's really, the demand for that is only going to grow. And we've already been able to prove that we can solve this issue, that we can really help, people think their way through. Now, the sad thing about that is that if people read more, it wouldn't be an issue, right? But because we're all computers now, we're not reading as much. We're not reading as in varied a way that we may have, maybe you read crime fiction and then you read, the New Yorker, or you read, whatever it was. We're limiting what we're reading, and good readers are good critical thinkers.
That's true. Do you think that's mostly down to technology out there?
No, I think it's down to the educational systems in Western societies. I think that we've changed from making people thinkers into making people mindless workers.
Yeah. Right. Well, you look at all the social media things that are out there right now. It's just, you just quickly look through it. You have literally 20 seconds to read it. Boom, you either like it or you move on to the next thing. Tweets are, how many comments? It's not a lot of material. So
it's a little bit of a condition of your environment, because I read your bio. You were almost an only child.
Yes.
I think you were 8 years old before your brother came along. Correct?
That's right. Yeah.
So when you're in that type of environment as an only child, I'm on the exact opposite end of the spectrum. I'm one of 10 kids. But,
oh my God!
But pretty much the same thing applied. You become an introvert, and I absorbed everything, like in terms of being able to read absolutely everything under the sun.
Yeah.
And I think if you look at, I guess, kids today, there's so many points of distraction. Instead of giving them a book, you give them an iPad.
That's right. It's all changing.
It's changing.
Yeah.
But you know what? I don't think that we can blame the technology. And in fact, I think social media has been a great liberator in terms of giving people access to information and things that they've never seen before.
That's so
and
true.
I think, games, kids playing games, that's super. I don't know about you. I was like a video game addict as a kid. I played everything from Pong, Ms. Pac-Man, even the word games that were on computers.
Classics.
And you had to think your way through it, whatever that was called, the Spectrum, the one with the rainbow on it.
Tetris.
Really?
There was Tetris, wasn't there? That was a big one back in the day.
This was even before we had like the stuff on the screen. It was when you're just typing in the words.
Commodore
64.
Yeah.
Oh, I remember those.
Right?
Yeah.
How can you remember?
I remember. I have a one of my good friends has a Commodore 64.
I'm with you.
So I think these are all really good things. But I actually blame the educational system. I really do, because if a government, any government, is so interested in economic growth and building that economic growth over and over and over and over, that means, especially say in the United States, the engine of economic growth in the United States is consumer spending. So you need people to work more, produce more, work longer hours, and then in their leisure time, spend money to put more into the economy, right? So governments have forgotten what they're actually there for, right? Governments are there to help people live their best possible life. Everybody, you know,
That's right.
that ideally, that is, but our educational system is failing us. And that is what these big multinationals and large organizations are telling me over and over and over again. They go, look, these people are lovely. They're really nice. They can regurgitate, you know, the history of, you know, the War of the Roses. But when it comes to asking them to go and critically look at, you know, 3 different offerings, they can't do it. They can't think for themselves. They don't know. They don't even have the framework for starting. So critical thinking skills and also things like scientific method, you know, you test, you experiment.
Yeah.
These are the ways that we create curiosity and that we shape brains, people who can think, who can invent, who can see their way through the fog. You know, clear thinking is very important when it comes to communication. So if you give people a framework for that, then you empower them for the rest of their lives.
Oh, yeah.
So,
Clear,
you know, and I just think this is we have to address this in our educational system now. Now I know that's going to put me out of business.
Not right away.
So many people. And
I feel a debate coming on. No, that's excellent. So I want to take it back, Margaret. I want to take it back to obviously when you were young. You know, your grandma played a big part in your life.
Yes.
For our audience who might not know that, what is that? What has that role played? You hear a lot of successful people say, you know, going back to their roots, it was my family, my mother, my father, my mentors, inspiration. How has your grandma made such an impact in your life today?
Yeah, I mean, my grandmother, you know, when I tell this story, people, I don't think they believe me, but I have all the documentation, so it's true. My grandmother was Irish, like my parents, and she grew up in a very poor part of rural Ireland called Carlow, and 1908, a terrible time of deprivation in Ireland. And she fell in love when she was a teenager with a much older fellow from the local village, and her mother did not approve. But this guy was in, they call it the old IRA, flying column. And she became involved in their kind of support organization called Cumann. So she was just besotted, and her mother was also part of Cumann. So anyway, at the age of 14, she was rounded up with these other girls who were serving as the communications network for these IRA flying column boys. They would take messages, hide them in their shoe, and my grandmother rode side saddle on her white pony Billy up Mount Leinster, down the other side of the mountain to deliver it to her friend Kitty, I think, who lived over the mountain. And then the message would be taken to the next person, and so on. So when she came back, she was there for about a year, and I have all the documentation of what she got from her mother, all that.
Wow.
She then moved to London because just the world seemed a much bigger place. She had a great time in jail, by the way, super time. She didn't have to work on the farm. She learned how to crochet. She learned how to set a table. They had plays. They sang. She didn't know any of these things because her father had died when she was 8. So she was pulled out of school at the age of 8. And she loved reading. She was an obsessive reader, but her mother wouldn't let her read. She'd take the books off her and throw her into the fire and say, Maggie, there's work to be done on the farm, and go out, go look after your 3 brothers and sisters. So she was always very hungry for books and knowledge. Anyway, the short version is that she went to London, she worked as a nanny, and then she wound up going to New York legally, working for this very wealthy Jewish family. She chased down my future grandfather, who was this older man, proposed to him, which was unheard of at the time. He said, I'm not the marrying kind, which he actually wasn't. But anyway, they got there. They had their first child, and then 1929 happened. They had their first child in October 1929. Disaster, right? Mm-hmm. He lost his job. He was working on the railway, but he was an alcoholic, so he lost his job for drinking. So my grandmother had a child to support in this strange city. So she started a boarding house on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and she had like 12 boarders. And she said to me one day, Margaret, all the boarders, they were lovely fellas, except this one fella, he was very queer, right? Now, that's Q-U-A or E, which means strange. He was very strange. I said, Grandma, why? What was wrong with him? He was American. He wasn't like the other ones.
Oh.
Grandma, you were in New York. That's in America? And she was like, oh, no, the other fellas, they were all Irish. They were grand. But this American fella, he ate strange things. And, So anyway, she brings her sister over to give a hand with the baby. And then it's Prohibition. So she starts making moonshine for the speakeasies on Coney Island, right?
Oh, I think I'd like your grandma.
Yeah, so would I.
Amazing. Amazing, right? So talk about an entrepreneur. I mean, she just got down to it.
Wow.
She made an absolute fortune, right?
Wow.
But in the meantime, her husband, who had come into the States illegally, he came in through Canada illegally, he got kicked out. So he was sent back to Carlow, middle of nowhere, but he was the youngest son, and he kept saying, Maggie, you're my wife, you have to come home. And she said, come home to what? There's nothing for us. So his mother, even though he was the youngest son, gave him the farm. So my grandmother had to go back. She had no interest at all in going back. None. Mm-hmm. She knew that was her future. She had to go back. And when she got there, her mother-in-law said, I'll take my dowry, please. And everything my grandmother made in New York, she had to give to her mother-in-law. Wow. So that was 1932. She had 6 more children. And again, my grandfather was never around. He was drinking or he was working on the roads in England. One of the children died. But it took her from 1932 to 1959 to get each of them out and to the United States, one by one. And she did that through education. And she said, there's one thing you have to do in this house. You have to be the top of the class all the time. Wow. So they got scholarship to the convent school. The girls all became nurses. And her son, who was the last one, then they emigrated when he was 14. And he wound up becoming a sociology professor at Georgetown and Harvard. They had nothing. Like, I've seen that house. And in 1959, there was no water, there was no indoor toilet, there was certainly no heating or electricity. And she did that pretty much single-handed because her family hadn't approved of the marriage, so they didn't help her out. They said, Maggie, you made your bed, you lay in it. So wow. I was named after her, and she lived with us our entire life. And wow. She was hilarious. She was absolutely hilarious, but quite a modest woman. And I didn't know that she had, been in prison. Until I was older. I thought this was just another one of Grandma's stories. But in the end, it's her story that actually brought me to Ireland. Wow. Because I was researching her story. And that led to me getting a dream job at the Irish Times. And here I am 20 years later. So, yeah, I mean, if I ever feel sorry for myself, oh, boo-hoo, I'm having a hard day, I just think of my grandmother and I go, yeah, shut up, Margaret, keep going.
It's nothing like prison.
That's awesome.
I love prison. Prison was a party.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
The farm in Carlow, that was torture. She loved being back in New York when she got back in New York.
That's awesome. Well, I mean, it absolutely sounds like you were inspired by a very strong woman that had a work ethic second to none. I think that's fantastic. And it's always interesting for me to meet individuals that have big family roots, because I come from one, and I think that's a pretty strong dynamic in being an interesting person, first and foremost.
Well, it's funny. I'll tell you something. You can say you come from one of 10.
Yep.
My first serious boyfriend in high school was the youngest son of 11 of an Irish-American family. And I spent years, I practically lived at that house.
I bet.
And the dynamic, I love that. All those people in and out, always something happening, somebody's always fighting.
Drama.
Could be a relatives, right?
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, we could.
It was so entertaining. It was like a Shakespearean play, where people would just come on stage and there'd be a drama, and then they go off the stage and then come on and there's new characters and then, So fair play that you survived that.
Yeah, no, well, I didn't have much of a choice. I'm at the older end of the orphanage, I guess. One of the things that popped to mind, and I was reading some of the notes that Johnny had given us prior to speaking to you. There's a point about diversity in business, diversity on the boards and in media. I'm not sure how much you might have paid attention to the recent Canadian election, where it was an international story around the world about diversity, equal representation within the government's cabinet. And I thought maybe you could expand a little bit more on that, because we talk about it, but a lot of times diversity happens almost accidentally, and then you look around and you realize that these people that come from all over or have different outlooks on life, they end up being your best friends because they're different and they have something interesting to say, and they contribute to you being a better person tomorrow than you were yesterday.
Yeah, well, I have to say, your prime minister is my hero. I was actually just speaking about him earlier today. I was at the Law Society of Ireland speaking about diversity, and I said, and I just want to say one of my heroes at the moment, and I said that, that quote where he said, why do you have a 50-50 cabinet? Because it's 2015. I mean, I just want to meet this guy. Like, he's amazing. So I guess for me, especially living in Ireland, I saw how little women are valued in the society. And keeping in mind who my grandmother was, a very strong, determined woman who had to raise these 7 children by herself on the side of Mount Leinster with no money and no support. She was only allowed to have, because she was a woman, small livestock. So she couldn't have the money makers like cattle or sheep. It wasn't allowed for a woman. You had to hire a man to do that.
So she could only have chickens?
She could only have chickens, and she could have little pigs that she would fatten up and sell on, and turkeys. Okay. So she's trying to sell, feed these children. So she might get eggs, and she might, she'd get berries, wild blueberries, and they'd pick those. And they said they never knew they were poor because my grandmother made it this great big adventure. But she was so talented and so determined, and really, the true sense of the word entrepreneur. She just did whatever was needed, to get stuff done. And then my mother, who was a similar character, came, nothing for her in Ireland, not part of any society. They weren't elite. They would never have a place in a small society. Came to the United States and very quickly worked her way up to work as a ward sister in nursing. So that's the top of the top. And she did that even before she met my father. But when my mother got married, she was expected to give up her job and just to mind the kids. Now, she loved children, but why? So I guess I grew up not knowing that I was any different. So I was raised to think, I'm as good as anybody else. I'm not, less than or greater than. I'm equal to. And that was just always in my head. And I was gender blind until I started really feeling it living in Ireland. I felt it on Wall Street as well when I realized the guy sitting next to me, who was 2 years junior to me, was making 25% more than I was. That was my first wake-up call. And I said it to a guy I worked with. He was in his 40s. I said, I just found out John, who is less qualified than I am and has been here, 2 years, he joined 2 years after I did. He's making 25% more than I am. I said, that is just outrageous. And he said, oh, but he's going to have to support a family one day, Margaret. I was like, one day. And he's like, yeah. He was looking at me like, what's wrong with you? This is just the way it is. And I didn't know that women were paid less. I had no idea. And so that was the first lesson in kind of, you're less than. And then in the workforce, as I progressed, I got more and more of these messages, right? So that was the big one. And I actually quit my job soon after, and that's when I moved to Ireland. And I just thought, I just cannot tolerate this. I'm here morning, noon, and night. I was working 14-hour days, and I just couldn't live in an environment like that. So moved to Ireland and had a number of interesting experiences as well in terms of once somebody realized I was their competition, so say working in a newsroom, they don't really notice you if you're a woman. They just think you're there for, I don't know, your secretary maybe. And once I started winning awards for investigative journalism, suddenly I'd start getting these snide comments. And they were always bordering on sexual harassment, but not quite. And at that time, they didn't really have strong sexual harassment laws either. And all these little things were happening, and they were really undermining. So, I started to dress differently. I love dressing like a woman. I think it's fab. Wear a skirt, makeup, change your hair color every day of the week. Whatever. It's a great privilege to be a woman. But I started wearing, baggy cardigans and loose trousers, and because I didn't want these comments, I just wanted to be appreciated for my work. And they were my bosses saying this to me, and even going into interviews and being, a guy who was about to interview and making a comment about the length of my skirt. So all these messages started coming out, and I thought, there's something very wrong about this. And I looked at all these really, really capable Irish women. Irish women are strong, they're very well read, they're incredibly competent, but they have very, very low confidence levels. And in fact, a study just came out. It was this huge, big study about confidence levels in women around the world. And Irish women are among the lowest in the world.
Really?
Wow.
Who is highest?
What's that?
Who would be the highest? What nationality?
Americans.
American? Okay, well, that's fair.
They're higher. And that is one thing. Americans have in spades. They might not be as competent, but boy, do they confidence, right?
Yeah, that's true.
And that it really does get you very far in life. So these things kept popping up, and then I looked around and I saw in my own profession that I tended to be the only woman on panels, right? So there'd be an economic conference, I was on the panel, radio and television, I was the only woman on the panel. And I was like, I'm not even an economist, I'm a financial journalist. Where's the Irish economist? And they're like, oh, there are no female economists, Margaret. What? What do you mean there are no female economists? I know 14 of them personally. Oh, women don't want to come on radio. I said, did you ask them? No, but they don't. They're busy.
Wow.
Wow, right?
Wow.
And I've done a lot of research on this over the last 5 years, and there's a perception that, women don't put themselves forward. But the difference is women, if they're asked, will go for it, right?
Yeah.
So research shows, say there's a CV, you guys probably know this. There's a CV, there are 10 things on the CV. If a man has 2 of the 10 things, a job description, 2 of the 10 things, he'll apply. If a woman has 9 out of the 10, or 10 out of the 10, she'll apply. So that's the confidence deficit. Women are very competent, but they lack confidence. So men, I think, in Western society are trained to put themselves forward for things where women are trained to sit back. But when you ask a woman, why don't you put your name forward for a board? Why don't you come on this panel? They'll do it.
Yeah.
They'll take more time making a decision. So producers and reachers will say, I ring up a man and I say, hi, this is, Johnny from Magna. Do you want to, yeah, when do you need me there? Well, I didn't even say what the topic is. It doesn't matter, I'll be there. He's like, yeah, I'll bluff my way through, it doesn't matter. You ring a woman and she'll go, can you give me a week? I need to do my research on that. Well, you're a PhD in that and you've been lecturing on it for 20 years and we only need to talk to you for 20 minutes. Well, I don't know. I don't know. So they take a little more convincing, but it's not that they don't want to be there. It's that they lack confidence in using their public voice. And there's a huge amount of research from the beginning of time about the way women have been discouraged from using their public voice. So the messages we get when we use our public voice tend to be negative. So you have to be very strong to do it over and over again. Mm-hmm. But I think generally it's a bigger risk. So we take our time thinking about what we're saying.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I want to go on to and understand, Margaret, a little bit more about the Woman on Air. What inspired you to start that?
So it was about 5 or 6 years ago, and there was this woman called Una Mullally who wrote an article called "Where Are All the Women on Irish Radio? Radio Gaga." And I know Una, and I challenged her on Twitter, and I said, Una, that's not true. There are plenty of women in Irish radio. And I started naming the big names. There may be 4 women. And she said, Margaret, I just want you to actively listen. So I thought, okay, fair enough. So I started listening, to commercial stations, the public service broadcaster, and I just started taking notes of how many times I heard a female expert as opposed to hearing a male expert. And overwhelmingly, it was about 90% of men all the time on the important things. Okay, so politicians, finance, all the things that really are important in society. But when it came to a victim, or a parent, the women, or, entertainment. That's when the women were allowed to come on and have their say. And again, I tended to be I won't call myself a token female. I tended to be the only voice on a lot of those panels. So I'd be on the economics panels. I'd be on the financial, radio programs. I had my own radio program, actually during the financial crisis as well. And I think I was the only financial journalist ever in Ireland who had a radio show. But I thought this was really weird because I was looking around thinking, I know all these amazingly competent, articulate, well-spoken women. Where the hell are they?
Yeah.
And when I asked them why, they're like, well, nobody asked me. And when I asked the producers and researchers and the media executive, they'd say, well, they don't exist. So I thought, okay, I'm going to start a list, right?
Oh.
So I started a list. It has over 1,000 women's names on it. So when they say, there are no female economists, I go, there are 14 of them. There's their contact details. You can bring them in 10 seconds.
JPEG, tweet back.
JPEG,
I think that's really,
social media, So I just thought, I'm all about, you can complain about stuff. That's okay. I don't want to hear it though. But unless you do, you can't complain. So we became a networking group. Then we started offering events and inspirational speakers, and it just grew and grew. I mean, I didn't really have time for it, to be honest, but it just happened.
Wow.
And we've launched a mentoring program, and then we wound up getting funded by the BAI and by Connecting Women in Technology. And now I stepped down last year because I'm on a number of boards and I didn't have time anymore. But it's had huge impact in terms of highlighting the issue and forcing change, particularly at the public service broadcaster. In the commercial sector, it's actually gotten a little bit worse. And you'd think they'd be embarrassed about it, but they're not. They're definitely not.
I find what you've just said very interesting because of my previous statement. And I know that coming from this interview that we've done with yourself, I'm going to listen to my radio stations that I listen to and from work to find out what the message is. And it's challenged my thought process because I feel that you've raised some very valid points, and I don't know if I've been aware of them.
Yeah, and it's funny, right? I wasn't. And I was an investigative journalist, right? How did I miss that? It was right in front of me. So I'm not talking about the presenters. It's not the presenters you need to monitor. You need to look at the experts that are brought in. Yeah. And when you hear a female expert, what are they talking about?
That's right.
Yeah.
But how do you differentiate between an expert and an amateur? Because everyone thinks that they're an expert. But
it wouldn't matter, though. It would just be matter what the topic is and what they've been brought in to either validate or offer their opinion on.
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
Interesting.
I mean, what you need to do, so my whole thing is, for a healthy democracy, we need a place where there's debate, a full debate, okay? I mean, that is really why I got into journalism. It's that whole, change the world stuff. So healthy democracy. So you need to, what are the most influential radio and television shows in Canada in terms of being, say, the first draft of public policy? Those are what you need to analyze.
Okay.
So in Ireland, during the financial crisis, there was research that showed that the financial experts that were brought on to discuss what was going on in the most, I think it was the 6 most important current affairs programs, guess what the percentage was? Male versus female.
Oh,
I don't even want to guess.
I'm going to go 5% versus 95%.
60-40.
97% male, but I skewed the numbers. The 3%.
Oh.
Okay, and I think there was maybe one other woman who was on one other time.
So it was you and someone else.
I mean, wow.
Yeah,
so
really wow.
You have to start actively listening and thinking about why is that and what are the negative implications of that for society, right? So who is filtering what we hear? Mm-hmm. Whose reality are we listening to? Who's shaping the first draft of public policy? Is it a fair representation of society?
No.
It's a big problem in the Western world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that for sure.
Wow.
Well, listen.
Deep, dude. It's deep. I know.
It's deep.
I quite enjoyed this because I mean, we always love learning about new people. We love to find out their story, their passion. What gets them. What gets them up and excited every day. I found added value in this conversation today because it's challenged my thought process against what I do on a day in, day out basis and my perception of what it is that I'm hearing and why.
Changed my whole perception. It's such an impactful podcast today, Margaret. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Well, look, guys, great questions. Terrific communicators there. So well done. And I love the whole concept. It's brilliant. I might have to steal it for myself.
Yeah. Anytime you come to Vancouver, you're more than welcome to stop by.
You just have to ask. We'll be on your show. No problem.
Brilliant.
Well, listen, guys, thank you so much. It's Friday. You're sitting on the spotlight. Entrepreneur, journalist, broadcaster, Margaret Ward. Thank you so much for being here. Love having you on the show. And make sure you guys on our podcast, check out iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher Radio, YouTube. We're blowing up. We're bringing you spotlight shows each and every week. Michael Flint, Rory McMillan. See you next Friday.
Thanks, Margaret.